think at the center of nearly everything that happens in any society is information, and how you, whether you call it media, disinformation, but how that information is distributed and who believes it and how credible it is really crucial in terms of how democracy functions or does not function. Obviously, in authoritarian states, the control of information, the control of media is just as important as controlling, I think, the police and the military and the other levers of power, whether it's judiciary. The media, or in a democracy, a free press, is one of the things I believe protects a democracy. And what we're seeing today around the world and even around the social justice movement is a lot of attacks on that and trying to discredit the information around that. Again, I think what's accelerated today, and it's really crucial to understand, is the way anybody with a phone, a cell phone, in a sense, is a publisher. Well, I think right now in the United States, you do have a social justice movement, several really coming from different points of view, framed in the context of a very divisive and intense and challenging election, as well as the pandemic. And historically in this country, there have been social justice movements, many over the history of the United States. I think one of the differences today is that there is now, it's tied into a heightened awareness of the history of the United States, especially when it comes to Black Lives Matter and slavery. You also have generationally, the millennials are people who grew up in a much more diverse America, who what we saw last spring and during the summer, that the movement in the street and the protests were clearly not simply in the Black community. There's a tremendous amount of support in the white community around the issue, and the polls have shown that. And that also triggered, the opposite when you look at the movement in this country around protecting certain rights, if you want to call it the white supremacist movement, certain members of the white community feeling that they're under assault and attack. And obviously, it's all exacerbated by the political moment we're in, which is a lot of it's based on fear and division and creating a situation where there is an other. Now tying that into the media in the late 60s, there was both the Vietnam War protests and the civil rights movement. It was a time when you basically had 3 television networks in America, major newspapers, community newspapers, regional newspapers, and radio. And there was not this instant world we live in today with the internet and technology and social media. So the speed and dissemination of information, both fake, propaganda, real, and the blurring of things happening, and obviously the capturing on video of incidents like the George Floyd killing, bring home and create a reality that might not have been witnessed 50 years ago. Now, one of the things that galvanized this country in the civil rights movement was the scenes of police dogs being set on men and women and children, protesters and African Americans in the civil rights movement being mowed down by fire hoses, beaten with clubs. And really that really also began to change, those images changed the way the rest of the United States saw that. The same thing happened with the Vietnam War. Once again, the media played a major role. It's still criticism today of the images that were shown on American television, American men and casualties, Vietnamese who were killed, and really the appalling nature of that war was brought home. It led to lots of changes in terms of what the US military allowed media to see or journalists to witness and be part of, and how they tried to control them in later wars. When I started in journalism a long time ago in 1970 at the New York Times, this was on the tail end, or really 6 years after the enactment of the Civil Rights Act in this country. So there was a heightened awareness of the lack of representation in newsrooms, not only of people of color, but women. And I recall that when I first started in journalism, the newsroom was, I would say 95, 97% white males. The social justice movement really did not affect, quote unquote, power structure of journalism or the media. But what we've seen as a result of the social justice movement and the activities that were really triggered by the killing of George Floyd last spring, was sweeping changes that have already really begun, and some have been quite painful, in news organizations throughout the United States, large and small. And leaders have left or lost their jobs. In some cases, probably deservedly so. In other cases, they were really potentially not, but they really felt like the newsroom, their organization had to change. And as a leader, they took responsibility for practices that may not have actually really supported diversity, not only in terms of what journalists cover, but really how the newsrooms were structured, organized, and who was really making in the decision-making process. So in the last 4 to 5 months, there have been some sweeping changes. I'm involved as a board member with 6 or 7 journalism nonprofits. Each of them has gone through a self-evaluation around issues of race in terms of who makes decisions, how stories are chosen, who and how are minorities in this country been reported on. And there's also been questions raised around the question of objectivity, which is sort of an age-old question. In other words, do you cover something giving both sides of a story a point of view if your belief is one side is amoral or wrong? This is a very slippery slope, because depending on who holds the reins of power, you could see this being abused and misused. You're not going to hear the voice in an authoritarian state of the opposition, because the press frequently is controlled by the government or is intimidated by the government. In a democracy, you can run into the same problems. If you believe a politician is corrupt or dirty or wrong, and you cover him or her a certain way and don't try and reveal or get them access to their side of the story, there's great potential for the credibility of that story to have been completely destroyed. And the story is vulnerable to that criticism. These people have an agenda, a bias, a point of view. So this question about new terms or definitions of objectivity, I think, is one that's going to be intensely debated. And I'm not sure what the outcome will be. But I do think that one of the things that has been sparked was a real honest and painful look at inside newsrooms and journalism organizations about who are making decisions. And a lot of this was really done, I think, in an honest but very painful and sometimes a way that really led to upheaval and change, and some very honest and difficult, intense conversations that probably should have been had long ago. So I do think you're going to see that reflected, these changes, the power of that movement in the American media community, journalism community. It's already begun. It's not going to happen everywhere. There are business models in this country, in the United States and elsewhere, that are clearly dependent on one political point of view, and that everything else that the other side does is either bad, evil, or misinterpreted. I don't think many of those news organizations are necessarily going to be open arms about having their staffs and their policies reflect the diverse nature of America, but I think the journalism organizations that hopefully have the most credibility over time will reflect the communities they cover.